My name is Jose Manuel Carrillo, and I'm an undocumented immigrant and a DACA recipient. I came to this country from Lima, Peru at the age of 8 and have been living here for 15 years. When allies come together in events like these with open ears to listen to directly affected communities and act accordingly, real and effective change happens. It brings me great joy to see everyone here gather in support of DACA and the young folks affected by the administration's decision. But it also greatly worries me, and I'm here to talk about why. We all have heard the arguments for DACA and for Dreamers. They came here through no fault of their own. They are business leaders that contribute to the economy. They have not committed any crimes. They are American in every way except on paper. I call this the Dreamer narrative. It is a narrative that is used both by allies as well as members of our own undocumented community. The moment I started thinking about this was when I was talking to the father of a DACA recipient. We were discussing DACA and how it influenced their child's future in this country. At what point in the conversation, I brought up the question of whether or not they felt safe being here. They looked at me and said, "No, but I did something wrong by coming here the way I did, and if anything happens to me, I deserve it." I did not know how to react. On one hand, I did not want to invalidate their experience, but on the other, I did not believe they did anything wrong by coming here with their children in hopes of bettering their future. At what point in the conversation, I brought up the question of whether DACA was in some way going to help them. And the truth is that DACA does nothing for the parents of recipients. So why was this person telling me this? Although laws and morality ideally line up, that is unfortunately always not the case. What sort of narrative had they internalized that made them say that their children deserved to be here, but that they, for some reason, did not? Up until this point, I had seen the Dreamer narrative pushed by young undocumented folks, progressives in the government, and allies. But hearing someone who did not fit into this Dreamer category, but was undocumented, use that narrative to justify the injustices which are committed towards them and their community, really moved me to start thinking about this. So, I started thinking, what is the root of this narrative? Who is damaged by it? And most importantly, what can we do to dismantle it and move towards a narrative which values human dignity at its core? A good place to start, I think, is the two main components of the Dreamer narrative, that is, economic benefit and assimilation. The economic benefit of having DACA recipients and people who fall into the box of Dreamers has been presented over and over in the media. Even this week, Defend DACA rallies and infographics related to supporting DACA often included some statistics about how much capital the US would lose if DACA recipients were to be taken away or deported. The idea of justifying immigration for economic benefit is not a new one to the United States. One example of this is the Bracero program, which from the 1940s to the mid-1960s allowed Mexican farm workers to come to the United States in order to work. The Bracero program made one thing clear: you are only allowed to be here because we can use you to further our economy. You are only here as a tool to the economic advancement of the United States. An astounding but not at all surprising amount of injustices, human rights, and labor abuses occurred under the Bracero program. The fact that these human beings were seen as tools for our economy made it easier to dehumanize them and thus oppress them. One may wonder, why did these farm workers come to the United States if they knew the Bracero program was so awful and abusive? The reality is that the way the agricultural and economical systems of their country have been destabilized, largely because of United States colonialism and Western policies, have made it impossible for them to make a living in their home and further their family and themselves. We must not forget the damage that the United States and colonialism has done to these countries that have made the living conditions so bad that they don't have much of a choice than to come to the United States in order to live a decent life. This damage is largely more than economic. It is political, cultural, and oppressive at the root of their humanity. But this didn't start in the 1940s. The idea of bringing people to this country for economic benefit goes back to our beginnings. Slaves were forced to come to the United States to, amongst other things, have their labor exploited in order to help our economy. It was one of the darkest and most horrible things that humans have done in our history. There were many ways people in that era tried to justify the bringing of slaves. Undoubtedly, racism and eugenics were huge factors, but the perceived economic benefit of forcing slaves to work was a significant one. And this is not to compare labor policies toward immigration to the violent capturing of people from their homeland, destruction of their culture, the institutionalized oppression that we still see to this day, and all the other damages that were caused by slavery. The point is to simply acknowledge the fact that the economic narrative had a huge role when it came to this chapter in our history. The presentation of people as only having capitalistic worth not only leads to exploitation, but ignores their humanity. In this present day, we must be mindful of where this economic argument for immigrants and for DACA recipients is coming from and why we still feel like that's an argument we need to use. I am not naive. I realize when we talk about immigration and supporting DACA recipients in Congress, whether that's the moderates or Republicans, we must appeal to some sort of economic label. However, when we, either as undocumented folks or allies, start internalizing and really believing this narrative, the rest of our community gets left behind. Now, aside from having economic benefit, how are these dreamers typically represented as? They are typically shown in the media as educated, narrowly meaning going to college, speaking perfect English, wanting to do something prestigious such as becoming a lawyer, a doctor, a teacher, joining the military, American in every way except on paper. By making these arguments, one is saying that you deserve to be here because you are like us, because you are more white than your other undocumented counterparts, because you have assimilated into the sort of person that the United States wants to be here. This is not to discount the young undocumented folks who overcame an immense amount of barriers to become doctors or lawyers, but simply to make it clear that it should not be a requirement to fit into this box of the perfect immigrant for one to be able to stay here in the United States. Talk like us, work like us, and look like us, and only then do you deserve to be here, is the message that we're pushing when we talk about assimilation and the Dreamer box. Is this a message we want to send to our undocumented community? That if you don't want to go to university and speak perfect English, that you somehow deserve to be here less than the dreamers portrayed in the media? They label us dreamers, but the sort of dreams that we're expected to have are only those that lead us to assimilating and benefiting their economy. What about those who dream of being musicians or painters? What about those who dream of just simply having a family and working a stable job? What about those who will never fit into this box of a perfect immigrant, either because they don't want to or because the way society is doesn't allow them to? By reinforcing the dreamer narrative, we are invalidating their experiences and leaving them behind. This causes harm both within the DACA recipient and young undocumented community, but even more so the undocumented community, which does not fit into that category. I do not like to be called a dreamer for those reasons. Dreamers, not criminals, a sign at a pro-immigrant rally reads. Undocumented parents and community members are criminalized and demonized while the spotlight is on DACA recipients. They deserve to be here just as much as the DACA recipients do. No human being deserves to be detained and deported. A few weeks ago, the Northwest Detention Center Resistance, which has been one of the main groups opposing the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, rallied in support of a woman, a mother named Cynthia. Cynthia is an undocumented mother of 2 children who was demanded to show up to the Department of Homeland Security for an appointment regarding her immigration status. She has been here for years. Cynthia showed up to ICE office in her work clothes. That's right, she could not take the day off to perhaps go to the most important appointments in her entire life, because if she took the day off, she would not be able to support her family. Cynthia showed up in her work clothes, holding hands with her younger daughter, who is 9 years old. About a dozen supporters held signs showing their support. She smiled when she saw us, thanked us for being there, and walked into the building with her immigration lawyer, hoping for the best. I was one of those supporters. We anxiously waited for 30 minutes. What I proceeded to see was one of the most heartbreaking things I have seen in my entire life. Cynthia's lawyer walked out of the building with her head down. Behind her, Cynthia walked out of the building with tears running down her face. Her 9-year-old daughter, still by her side, grabbed onto her mother's clothing with all the strength that her little hands could exert. I cannot imagine the fear and despair that Cynthia and her family were going through at that moment. In between sobs and tears, she told us that she had 2 months to leave the country and had no chance of coming back. Throughout all of this, a daughter held tightly onto her mother as if immigration custom enforcement agents were physically going to take her mother away from her. At no point while watching this did I wonder if Cynthia contributed to the economy. At no point did I wonder if Cynthia qualified for DACA. At no point did I wonder if Cynthia spoke perfect English. At no point did I wonder if Cynthia wanted to go to college. At no point did I wonder if Cynthia deserved to be taken away from her family for coming to this country the way she did. At that point, none of the typical defenses that we use to justify the fact that DACA recipients deserve to be here mattered. The fight for an undocumented community is about human dignity. It is about overcoming our colonialist, racist, and capitalistic views and allowing ourselves to really feel compassion for undocumented people for the fact that they are human. We must fight for the whole community. And there are many ways to do this. An important one being dismantling this current narrative and moving toward one that places human dignity as its foundation. However, this is not enough. We must move to dismantle the institutions which tear families like Cynthia's apart. We must move to oppose the creation of more detention centers, the hiring of more ICE agents to conduct raids that physically tear families apart, the surveillance of immigrants, the militarization of the border, and many of these other programs which come from a place of hate. My call to action to you allies is this. While we fight for DACA, we must let our representatives know that we do not want our taxpayer dollars to go to these institutionalized programs which come purely from a place of hate. We must ask them to vote no on any bill that adds funding to immigration enforcement. Furthermore, we need to ask our representatives to take the offensive and publicly call for cuts to this budget, and to instead use that money on things like education, healthcare, and housing that our community actually needs. You can find information on how to do this at the information table. I'm currently running a campaign in Washington called Defund Hate Washington, and we have a call script and a petition if you are coming from Washington. Idaho friends, I know the climate's a little different here with your representatives, but if you're interested in starting something like this in your state, come talk to me. Have these conversations about this narrative with members of your undocumented community as well as allies. Keep listening and keep supporting the whole undocumented community as well as other oppressed communities. Keep coming to events like these. Oppression at its root is the dehumanization of people. Yes, DACA recipients deserve to be here, but the rest of the undocumented community does as well. This fight for a documented community is about human dignity. We must not forget that. If you are moved to fight for DACA, we must be moved to fight for all. Thank you.